So thank you very much, Marius, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here. Always nice to come to Rome in one way or another, even by Zoom. So tonight I want to talk about hylomorphism and give a kind of introduction to it. So hylomorphism is fundamentally an account of the natural world that explains the nature of substances and the ways that they move or change. You can recognize change when it happens, but it's hard to say exactly what change is. So our first question is, what is change, or what is motion? It reminds me, oops, what do we got to do here? We need to share our screen. That's what we need to do. Okay. Okay. All right. So what is motion? What is change? All right, now we're moving. Okay. This reminds me of St. Augustine's question about time. He asks, what is time? If nobody asks me, I know. But if I were desirous to explain it to one that should ask me, plainly, I do not know. And it's the same with motion or change. We all know what it is until we try to explain it. So what is motion? Often we just come up with synonyms for it. Motion is, well, it's a moving along, it's a proceeding, it's a going, or maybe it's a kind of a moseying, something like the famous 100-yard mosey in the Far Side cartoon. It's mysterious. How do you define a coming to be? Perhaps we can get some idea of what motion or change is and what it requires by considering what it is not. So when a block of ice melts, we say that the ice changes into water. But if a block of ice is simply replaced with a bucket of water, we don't say that the ice has become water. Why not? Perhaps we have an intuition that true change always involves some continuity. When one thing becomes another, something of the first remains somehow in the second. If nothing of the first remains, we're not really dealing with change, but substitution. In addition to continuity, change also requires, of course, some newness. We don't say that a thing has changed unless it's modified in some way, unless there's something new or different about it. So change always involves continuity and newness. For the water in our example, as you see here, this involves passing from an original frozen state into a new liquid state while remaining water. More generally, we can say that change always involves passing from some original actuality to a new actuality while remaining in some way the same. There is always some principle of continuity that endures through the change. The earliest Western philosophers, the Presocratics, were fascinated by change. They looked for a principle of continuity, not just for individual changes, but for all change. Thales said it was water. All things are really water in one form or another. As water becomes ice when it freezes and vapor when it evaporates, so all material things down deep are water in one form or another. Anaximenes went a step further. He taught that all things are air in one form or another, but he also suggested a way by which air can become other things. In its original density, air manifests itself simply as air. But if it's compressed into greater density, as the slide suggests, it becomes water. At still greater density, it becomes earth, rocks, metals, and so on. And if it's rarefied or made less dense, it can become fire. So Anaximenes saw air as the basic fundamental reality of the whole natural world. It remains, in some sense, always air, but takes on different properties as it's rarefied or condensed. It may sound peculiar to us to say that air is the fundamental reality underlying all natural things, and somehow persists through all changes, that all things are basically air in different states of rarefaction and condensation. But I think that modern science still clings in some ways to the basic intuition of Anaximenes. As he thought that all things down deep are really air, science teaches that all things down deep are really protons, neutrons, electrons, quarks, and so on. These particles are thought to remain the same in themselves when they're restructured into other things, such as bunnies, squirrels, and human beings. The philosopher Milton Nahm argues that Anaximenes, in his philosophy, made a giant step towards modern science and our modern worldview. He says, Anaximenes improves upon the views of his fellow Milesians by offering an ordered sequence of change and by submitting for examination a specific process by which the varied states of objects in the world of experience could have been produced from air. Air, we are told, assumes different states through the process of rarefaction and condensation. Rarefied air is fire. As air is condensed more and more, it is, in order, wind, water, earth, and stones. No explanation is given of the means by which the process begins, but with the theory of rarefaction and condensation, Milesian philosophy has advanced far. In the first place, Anaximenes' hypothesis is one suitable for experimental verification. Secondly, it offers a possibility for reducing to quantitative differences such intangible qualitative differentiations as hardness, softness, and so on. Our scientific account of the world also tends to reduce qualitative features to quantities. So we reduce the delicate shades of the sunset to certain wavelengths of light. We can also reduce human beings to various chemicals. The chemicals are thought to retain their own identity within the human being. So, as the diagram shows, the human being is about 65% oxygen and 18% carbon. That also explains why, in one Star Trek episode, aliens describe human beings as ugly carbon bags of mostly water. But we might wonder where we can find the actual human being in the midst of these chemicals. And if the human is reduced to a collection of chemicals, we might ask how such characteristic human features as thought and freedom arise. The philosopher John Searle explains this dilemma. He says, we think of ourselves as conscious, free, mindful, rational agents in a world that science tells us consists entirely of mindless, meaningless physical particles. Now, how can we square these two conceptions? If this dilemma arises when humans are reduced to a collection of chemicals, we may want to reconsider Aristotle's hylomorphic account of change, which can admit the apparent plurality of elements in dogs, cats, and humans, but still maintain the substantial unity, identity, and integrity of each of these things. Aristotle saw that in any change, there must be a principle of continuity and a principle of newness. He called the principle of continuity matter, or hyle in Greek. The word refers to the wood of the forest, which has the potency or possibility to be made into various things, such as tables and chairs. He calls the principle of newness form, or morphe in Greek. This refers to the particular form or shape that distinguishes a table from a chair. Combining the two Greek words, his philosophy of matter and form became known as hylomorphism. Aristotle recognized two fundamentally different kinds of change in the natural world. In one, called accidental change, a substance is modified incidentally while remaining the same basic thing. We can see an example of this in the construction of a log cabin, where the logs remain logs throughout the change and are simply given a new accidental shape or structure. In the second kind of change, called substantial change, a whole substance becomes a different kind of thing. To see the difference between substantial and accidental change, we might consider the sad case of little Johnny, who gets a new puppy for his birthday. While no one is looking, the puppy runs out into the street and gets smashed by a cement mixer. Poor Johnny is heartbroken, but his dad tries to console him. Unfortunately, Dad is a reductionist. So Dad says, "Don't worry, Johnny, the puppy is still here. He's just had his parts rearranged. We'll just get a shovel, scoop him up, and put his parts back together." Now, little Johnny, who's a budding hylomorphist, knows better. This is not just an accidental change or a rearrangement of parts. It's a substantial change. The cute little puppy has become an entirely different sort of thing. Technically speaking, we might say that the little pup has become a clump of crud. In any case, the pup is dead and can't simply be reassembled. The principle of continuity in substantial change cannot itself be a substance, since it's the substance that's changing. The substance is precisely what does not endure through the change. Nor can the principle of newness be a mere incidental factor, such as the rearrangement of logs when they become a cabin. Since it's not mere incidental novelty that needs to be explained, but substantial newness, a new substance, a new being. Aristotle concludes that any substance, capable of becoming a different kind of substance, must have two principles, one to explain continuity and another to explain newness. Neither of these principles can itself be a substance. The principle of continuity is not a substance. It's rather the mere possibility of being a substance. And the principle of newness is not itself a substance. It's not a thing or a what. It's rather that by which a thing is a certain sort of thing. In Aristotelian philosophy, the principle of possibility is commonly called primary matter, and the principle of newness, substantial form. To avoid confusion with other meanings of the term matter, however, here I'll refer to primary matter simply as possibility of being. Each changeable substance, such as wood and ashes, is composed of two principles: possibility of being, which explains why the substance can cease to be what it is and become something else, and substantial form, which explains why the possibility of being is currently actualized as this particular kind of substance. Neither of these principles is a mere idea or abstraction. Each is a real physical principle, a real aspect of the physis or nature of any material thing. Now, dualism is avoided here, since neither of these principles is itself a complete thing or a complete substance. We're not dealing with two distinct entities or two complete things somehow joined together. We're concerned with two principles, neither of which is itself an independent entity. Neither is able to exist by itself, and neither is complete in itself. The two principles bespeak a certain complexity in all changeable things, but such complexity is implied in the very fact of change itself, which always involves both a principle of continuity and a principle of newness. Such complexity does not imply dualism, since each substance, though composed of these two principles, is one substance, one thing, not a conglomeration of two things. This is quite different from the dualistic philosophy of Descartes, for instance, where a human being is viewed as composed of two complete substances, an extended thing called the body, and a thinking thing called the soul. An example of accidental change may be helpful here in explaining Aristotle's account of the four causes of change in his philosophy: material, formal, efficient, and final. Suppose I take a block of clay and gradually shape it into a sphere. The clay is the matter or material cause. The spherical shape is the formal cause that makes the clay to be round. I'm the agent or efficient cause. My purpose or end in shaping the clay is the final cause. For instance, perhaps I'm shaping the clay in order to explain the philosophy of hylomorphism. The clay is initially actualized by the accidental form of square, but it could be actualized by a different accidental form, such as round. I act as the agent or efficient cause in shaping the clay. Through my pushing and pulling, the clay is eventually no longer disposed to the accidental form of square, but to the accidental form of round. At that point, a new accidental form is educed from the potency of the matter, and the clay is now round. As an efficient cause, I've made the square clay to be round. The motion of shaping itself may be described as the act that belongs to the clay, that is in potency to the new shape of roundness, precisely insofar as it is still in potency to that new shape. Once the new shape is attained, the motion of shaping will be over. So motion can be defined as the act of a being in potency insofar as it is in potency. The thing to notice here is that for all my pushing and pulling, the clay will not be actually round until it has a round shape, until it has the accidental form of roundness. In some way, therefore, it's the accidental form of roundness that makes the clay to be round. The shape does not make the clay round by pushing, pulling, or exerting any force on it. It does not act as an efficient cause. Rather, it acts as a formal cause. A formal cause exerts its causality by making something to be the kind of thing that it is. In this example, we're dealing with an accidental form, a particular shape. The round shape is the formal cause that makes the clay to be actually round. The shape is that by which the clay is round. Similarly, a substantial form does not act as an efficient cause when it makes primary matter to exist as one sort of substance or another. It exerts no force and supplies no energy. It exercises its causality precisely as a formal cause. It makes the possibility of being to be actually a particular kind of substance, such as hydrogen, carbon, dog, or cat. To illustrate this, you can take an example from biology. We'll give a philosophical account of how a puppy comes into being. We begin with the dog's parents, technically known as mama dog and papa dog, seen here with the whole family. First, mama dog produces an ovum and papa dog produces a sperm. A dog ovum is a living substance. It's the kind of substance it is because of its substantial form. It can become a different kind of substance because of its primary matter or possibility of being. The same is true of sperm. It is what it is because of its substantial form and can become something else because of its possibility of being. When ovum and sperm are united, the primary matter of both is no longer disposed to the substantial form of sperm or ovum, but it is now disposed to the substantial form of dog. The substantial form of dog is then educed from the potency of the matter, resulting in a new substance, the puppy. The substantial form is not a ghost or a spirit. It's a physical principle of each material substance, which makes the substance to be the kind of thing it is. which actualizes or determines possibility of being to be a particular kind of substance. The substantial form of dog, for instance, makes the whole dog to be dog, from its nose to its tail. Since a thing acts or behaves according to what it is, and since the substantial form explains what a thing is, the substantial form also explains the way it acts. Since it is a dog, it acts as a dog. So the substantial form of dog explains why the dog barks, scratches, and does all manner of other doggy things that we really don't need to mention here. Simply put, that which makes a dog to be a dog, or that by which a dog is a dog, explains both why the dog is a dog and why it acts as a dog. If we accept Aristotle's hylomorphic account of nature, we don't need to deny the scientific teaching that atoms are somehow composed of protons and electrons, or that human beings are somehow composed of elements such as calcium, carbon, and so forth. We should notice, however, that the behavior of the parts of an atom within the atom as a whole is quite different from the way they would behave apart from the whole. Likewise, the behavior of the elements in a human being is quite different from the way such elements would act apart from the human being. Science itself has noticed this. William Wallace describes it using the example of a sodium atom. He says, "A free electron, one not bound within an atom, is completely controlled by its own mass and electric charge. When within the atom, however, it obeys Bohm's quantum rules, not falling into the nucleus or radiating when it is in its assigned orbit, making only its allowed transitions. On its own, each electron would be indifferent to the particular energy state it might occupy within the atom. Within the atom, according to the Pauli exclusion principle, each electron is assigned to a unique state occupied by no other. The behavior of the electron in the Bohr atom of sodium is dictated not by the form of electron, as this might exist outside the atom, but by the unifying form of sodium. So why does the electron in the sodium atom behave differently from a free electron? A thing acts according to what it is. Since the electron behaves differently as part of the sodium atom, perhaps the electron in the sodium atom is not simply an electron, but is sodium, a part of the structure of the sodium atom. Like the rest of the sodium atom, then, it is sodium. That is to say, it is primary matter actualized by the substantial form of sodium. If the substantial form of sodium can account for the distinctive behavior of an electron within a sodium atom, the substantial form of a living organism can account for the much more profound differences in behavior of its parts. The substantial form of a living thing is called soul. The soul does not negate the distinctive parts of the living organism, but it does explain why these parts can act as one organism. As Ivandro Agassi explains, each organism effectively constitutes a unity, but a unity which does not deny the difference of parts, and which is even assured by the existence of the difference. If we do not fear using old notions, we can say that the unity is guaranteed by the substantial form in the profound Aristotelian sense of this concept, which means at the same time an ontological criterion of specificity, a factor of organization, and of functional and finalized coordination. A dog, for instance, is in some ways composed of elements like carbon and calcium, just as the electron in the sodium atom is not simply an electron, but is rather sodium, that is, primary matter actualized by the substantial form of sodium. So the carbon in the dog is not simply carbon, but is rather dog. That is, primary matter actualized by the substantial form of dog. We might say with the scholastics that carbon is virtually present in the dog, since it still manifests some of the properties, powers, or virtus of carbon, properties that it would manifest apart from the dog. Within the dog, however, the carbon does not exist as carbon, but as dog. It exists as primary matter actualized by the substantial form of dog. The substantial form specifies that the substance resulting from the actualization of primary matter is a dog, from nose to tail. At the same time, it explains why the substance is organized or structured as a dog, from its molecular structure to its physiological structure of nose, ears, and tail. Finally, it explains why the substance acts as a dog for the ends that are proper to the well-being of a dog. Now, the human being is also composed of substantial form or soul and primary matter or possibility of being. The soul, as a substantial form, accounts for the whole substance and all of its parts. This is quite different from an accidental form, like the form of a house. Each part of a house, whether wood or bricks or shingles, has its own substantial form. The accidental form of the house does not explain the existence of its parts, but only the accidental arrangement of the parts. As Aquinas explains, now, the substantial form perfects not only the whole, but each part of the whole. For since a whole consists of parts, a form of the whole which does not give existence to each of the parts of the body is a form consisting in composition and order, such as the form of a house. And such a form is accidental. But the soul is a substantial form, and therefore it must be the form and the act not only of the whole, but also of each part. William Wallace describes this in greater detail. He says, human nature, and the human soul in particular, is thus the unifying and stabilizing principle to which all of man's life activities can be traced, the primary principle, in Aristotle's word, by which we live or sense or think. In virtue of that principle, a person not only senses and thinks, but also wills, perceives, reacts emotionally, and moves the limbs. It lies behind the homeostatic equilibrium humans maintain with their environment, the metabolism whereby they assimilate food, the processes through which their bodies grow and develop, and ultimately reproduce. It even explains the ways in which ion concentrations are maintained in the body fluids, how radioactive tracers are carried to one or another of the organs, and ultimately why the body floats in water and falls in accordance with the laws of gravity. In a word, the natural form is what makes a person one organism, with a diversity of parts, each capable of being coordinated in unified activity, which reaches its perfection in the use of reason and the exercise of free will. So, in Aristotle's philosophy, our human capacity for consciousness, knowledge, and freedom is not the enigma that it was for John Searle. It is rather a consequence of the human substantial form. That form explains why the human is human, and so is able to act in characteristic human ways. The substantial form or soul accounts for the whole human being at all levels of being and activity, physical, animal, and spiritual. On the physical level, it explains why the human being is a physical substance and therefore subject to the law of gravity. On the animal level, it explains why the human is alive and capable of physical motion and metabolic activity. It also explains why the human being is capable of emotional reactions, such as fear and anger. On the spiritual level, It explains why the human can exercise reason and free will in its graced movement towards God. Aristotle's discussion of hylomorphism of actuality and potency in his Physics ultimately opens on to an affirmation of the supreme actuality, the unmoved mover, at the end of the Physics. Aquinas identifies this supreme actuality as God. He says, and thus the philosopher ends his discussion of natural things with the first principle of the whole of nature, who is over all things, God, blessed forever. Amen. At this point, the philosophy of nature opens on to metaphysics, which is able to study not just changeable being, but being as being, and God as the principle of being. As pure actuality, God is recognized as the transcendent cause of all actuality. Yet creatures also have their own proper causality as they participate in God's causality. Among creatures, there are, as you see in the 4 columns here, necessary causes that produce necessary effects that cannot not happen, and there are contingent causes that produce contingent effects that may or may not happen. And among contingent causes, we may locate human free will and chance. God transcends the whole order of creaturely causality. As Aquinas explains, there is a difference to be noted on the part of the divine will, for the divine will must be understood as existing outside of the order of beings, as a cause producing the whole of being and all of its differences. Now, the possible and the necessary are differences of being, and therefore necessity and contingency in things and the distinction of each according to the nature of their proximate causes originate from the divine will itself, where he disposes necessary causes for the effects that he wills to be necessary, and he ordains causes acting contingently, that is, able to fail, for effects that he wills to be contingent. And according to the condition of these causes, effects are called either necessary or contingent, although all depend on the divine will, as on a first cause, which transcends the order of necessity and contingency. This, however, cannot be said of the human will, nor of any other cause, for every other cause already falls under the order of necessity or contingency. Hence, either the cause itself must be able to fail, or, if not, its effect is not contingent, but necessary. The divine will, on the other hand, is unfailing, yet not all its effects are necessary, but some are contingent. As the ultimate transcendent cause, God is also, in a special way, the cause of the human soul. Unlike the substantial forms of other material things, such as dogs, which are simply educed from the potency of matter, the human soul has a spiritual character, evidenced in the human capacity for universal knowledge. The human father produces a sperm, and the human mother produces an ovum. When sperm and ovum are united, the primary matter of these entities is no longer disposed simply to the substantial form of sperm or ovum. It is rather disposed to the substantial form of human being. At that point, the soul is simply created by God, and the human child is instantiated. Again, because of its spiritual character, the human soul, unlike the substantial form of other material things, can continue to exist when separated from the human material principle at death. It may then enter into eternal life with God to be united with the human material principle once more in the general resurrection at the end of time. And speaking of time and the end of time, that's where we're at now, the end of time for this lecture. If you'd like to continue this introduction to hylomorphism, however, I'd suggest these two books for further reading. Both are available at lulu.com. Thank you.